I used to be employed as a child protection worker. A report came through one day about a stepfather who was being abusive to his children. I was given the investigation by my team leader. When I interviewed the oldest child with the police, she had very visible physical injuries and told me exactly what happened. I'll spare the details, but it was pretty horrific. As the children were in his sole care, we knew they needed to be removed immediately. We sent a team of 2 workers out to the children's school, while myself and a colleague called the stepfather into the office. I led the interview, and it was horrible. He didn't even try to deny he had hurt his children, instead basically saying, "That's my kid and I'll do what I want. You can't stop me." Well, when I served him with the paperwork, he absolutely lost his mind. He was swearing and screaming and basically said, "If we were outside this building right now, I would fucking kill you." We ended up running out of the interview room, pressing the emergency alarm. I even had to make a police report about the whole thing. It got really messy. The next day, we had court for the children, and my manager decided I shouldn't attend due to everything that happened the previous day. My colleague who did attend told me the man was at court and even yelled several times something to the effect of, "Where is that cunt of a worker who took my kids?" I remember feeling a little freaked out. It's not uncommon to hear things similar to this when you have to remove a child. It's understandable that emotions are very high. You build a sort of resilience working in this field though, and overall I mainly felt relieved those children had been placed with an aunt and were now safe from that man. About 2 weeks later, I had to stay back late at the office on an unrelated job. It was about 9 p.m. when I finished, and I was the only person there. I walked out the back of the building to my car. It was really dark, but when I got close, I thought I saw a shadow moving around the front of my car. It was just for a second, and then it was gone like it was never there. I was about 20 meters away at this point, but that really startled me. I stood there for a moment, just looking at my car and wondering if I was being paranoid. While staring into the darkness, I started hearing these tiny rustling noises. Whether imagined or not, all the true crime horror stories I've ever heard flashed into my mind. Safe to say, I freaked out and sprinted back to the building. I called my boyfriend to come pick me up, explaining what had happened. By the time he drove up to the front doors, I had convinced myself I was being silly and asked him to drive me around to my car. He circled around, and with the headlights now shining on it, I could very clearly see all 4 of my tires had been slashed. I was an absolute mess that night and called the police immediately. I was pretty sure that man was responsible, but as I hadn't actually seen him, I couldn't say for sure. I took a few days off and came back to a meeting with my manager, who had put together a safety plan for me and the other staff. She'd organized to have a security guard escort us to our cars, and said very clearly no one was to stay in the building after hours alone. Then, about a week later, a letter was delivered to the office addressed to me. Any mail that comes into the office goes through our reception staff. Our lovely receptionist opened it. Inside was a note that said, "You're as good as dead, bitch." She's an older woman, so she burst into tears as she read that. It didn't say who had sent it, but I was pretty sure I had an idea. Over the next few weeks, letters kept coming, each one getting longer. They always addressed me as a bitch or a homewrecker, saying I kidnap and abuse children. It was just horrible, horrible stuff. The threats in all the letters were even worse. The person writing them threatened to torture, kill, find out where I live, and burn down the entire building. To be honest, the police were less than helpful. They basically said given the nature of our work, they couldn't conclusively say it was that man, although they already had questioned him. To me, it all seemed like a pretty massive coincidence. I'd never had anything like this happen before. They did say they were taking the letters very seriously and tracking down where they'd been posted from, but I never heard anything back about that. My workplace took the threats seriously too. All the security was bumped up across the building, and all staff completed refresher training on emergency management. One day, on the way home from work, I noticed a car seemed to be following me. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid, so I drove down a bunch of little side streets, double-backed onto the same route in a way that would make absolutely no sense too. Even after all that, the dark green Camry was still placed just a little ways behind me. I freaked out, but I'd already planned in my head what I was going to do in this situation. I headed straight to the police station, planning to pull right up to the front of the building and beat my horn until I had someone's attention. The second I pulled in, the green Camry shot straight past me and disappeared down a nearby side street. I sat there for a good 20 minutes, too scared to get out of the car in case they came back around the corner. It dawned on me that in my panic, I'd forgotten to get the license plate. Honestly, that still kind of upsets me to this day. I told the police what I knew, but they told me the man didn't have any registered car in his name. This was the final straw for me. I was a nervous wreck. I was looking around constantly at work and at home. I knew he lived relatively close to me, so I even stopped grocery shopping just in case I ran into him. I stayed on stress leave for a month and heard from colleagues that the letters kept arriving all the same. I was honestly ready to quit, but then COVID happened, and it really changed everything. Everyone went into lockdown, and all access to the office was restricted. I started back working from home, driving a work car to and from appointments. I didn't go into the office regularly anymore, only in small working groups when absolutely necessary. Over the next year, the letters slowed down and eventually stopped. By the time we were allowed back in the office, there hadn't been any sign for almost 7 months. About a year later, I left child protection. I don't know what happened to those children, but my hope is they're happy and safe with a new family. As for the man who I believe stalked and threatened me for doing my job, I hope I never have to run into him again. Last night, I encountered a situation that truly made me realize the value of life over materialistic possessions. I need to process this, so any insights or perspectives would be greatly appreciated. Background: the incident took place around 2 a.m. after a party on the west side of Chicago. It's important to note that this particular area is notorious for a high crime rate. I'd been at this informal backyard gathering with a close buddy. We were just trying to unwind and have a good time. Throughout the evening, though, I couldn't help but notice one guy who, for reasons unbeknownst to me, seemed to have taken issue with my presence there. This wasn't the first party where I'd felt this unsettling gaze or heard his unwarranted insults either. As the night came to a close, my buddy and I decided to leave. On our way out, I took a brief moment to relieve myself by a nearby wall. Following that, we waited by a car while our Uber was en route. As we stood there, the aforementioned guy approached me, engaging me in what seemed to be an attempt at conversation. When he asked what I was up to, I reciprocated the question, trying to keep things fairly casual. At some point, I inquired if he had anything. I honestly can't recall why I did that, and declined when he confirmed. Looking back, he might have interpreted my demeanor as challenging or confrontational. Things escalated terrifyingly fast. He'd called over a friend, and before I could even process what was happening, they lunged at me together. Suddenly, it felt like the whole party was turning against me. I was surrounded by over 10 people now, all of them attacking me with an intensity I'd never experienced before. Punches, kicks, shouts, screaming. The chaos was overwhelming. As they assaulted me, they grabbed my chain, my phone, and my bag, which thankfully was empty at the time. My friend was powerless to intervene. Even more shockingly, the security present, rather than diffusing the situation, tried to join in. I tried to protect myself, focusing on shielding my head, but there was no way I could fend off such a large group, especially given some of them were armed and had clear gang affiliations. After what felt like an eternity, they finally let up, hurling final insults and threats at me as they ordered me to leave. My buddy and I staggered away, grateful to escape with our lives, but deeply shaken. I'm still grappling with what happened that night. Why did they target me so viciously? Was there some underlying issue I wasn't aware of? And why had the situation escalated so quickly? When I was a senior in college a few years ago, I lived in an old house about a 5-minute walk from my campus with 5 of my girlfriends. It was still COVID times, so we spent a lot of time just in the house since we couldn't really go anywhere. To preface this, the house was really old. Many of the windows didn't even lock because of how old it was. Our landlord sucked too, as many college ones tend to do. They refused to do anything to fix the issue. With it being 6 of us and often a boyfriend or 2 sleeping in the house though, it mostly felt safe, and many of us would keep our windows open. Our college was in a town just outside of the second most dangerous city in the state, but right around the campus it felt relatively safe. When the weather started getting warmer in early spring, we would sit out on the roof to sunbathe together. This roof faced our street. We would access the roof from my roommate's, let's call her Mary, bedroom window on the 2nd floor. It led straight up there. Our street was residential and didn't get a ton of traffic. We did have a couple of encounters of a younger guy's catcalling us as they drove by, but nothing seemed too sinister. One night in the late semester though, Mary went up to her room to call her brother while the rest of us were hanging out downstairs. That's when she rushed back downstairs and said she'd seen a ladder leading up to the roof, where we would all usually sunbathe. It was right next to her window, which was open. Later, we learned she said out loud to her brother what she saw before she came down. When she told us this, my other roommate and her boyfriend ran outside, only to find a man swiftly running away from our house with the ladder in tow. We assumed he must have heard Mary telling her brother she'd seen him and knew he was caught. It was dark, so we couldn't make out much about him. I immediately texted our landlord, asking if he had someone to come by and do emergency housework. He said no. We then called the police, who came by soon after. They did some investigating and patrolled our house for a couple of nights, but we never found out who the man was, what his true intentions were, or even if he'd been there before. Hi everyone, I usually don't share my own experiences, but I need to get out what just happened a few hours ago. This seemed like the perfect place to share. For some background first, I'm a 29-year-old woman. I live in an apartment in a sketchier side of town, so I'm not unaccustomed to strange people pulling up and strange things happening. I've been through a home break-in even, so I'm hyper-vigilant when it comes to keeping myself and my home safe. I smoke cigarettes, a nasty habit I know, but having cats and not wanting my house to reek of smoke, I'll often walk out to my balcony to do a quick smoke. And that's exactly what I was doing when this incident occurred. I was sitting on my balcony smoking, just enjoying my night, when I noticed a car I'd never seen before pull into the back parking lot of my apartment, right next to my balcony. I could immediately feel something a bit off, but I didn't want to come off as being a paranoid neighbor or something. I just kept sitting and minding my own business, smoking my cigarette. Then though, I began to hear footsteps, making a beeline through my backyard. I looked down, only to see a large burly man I'd never seen before, skulking about in my backyard. Again, I didn't try to make much of it. Maybe they were there for my neighbor or something. My anxiety was definitely on high alert, but I was not in panic mode yet. That was until I realized he was going straight for my portion of the area. He then did something that's still freaking me out as I typed this. He stopped right underneath, looked up at me on my balcony not saying a word, and began to just stare at me. Now I was in absolute panic mode. I audibly said, "Oh, fuck this." I sprang up, slammed and locked my balcony door, ran upstairs to my bathroom and dialed 911. I listened to every sound from downstairs while I stood there panicking in my bathroom. I could hear what sounded like him trying to mess with my back door now. I can't say for sure though because I was in hypervigilance mode. I do know that he was in my backyard for a while longer, because I was in my bathroom for several minutes until I decided to peek out my balcony window, only to see him walking to his car and jumping in. That tells me I don't think he was there to rob me, but to do something more sinister. Luckily, he must have been lazy, because again, I live on the cheaper side of town, so you can imagine the quality of my doors and locks. I'm really hoping it was just some guy who was drunk or high and had the wrong house, but something is telling me it's otherwise. Let me start off by saying I'm a 16-year-old male and an only child who lives in a quiet rural area surrounded by fields and Amish country. I'm going to use the alias John for this story. One Saturday evening, after an afternoon of occasional rain showers, I was home alone while my parents were out for their anniversary. They had just recently left to go out when I decided to take a walk now that the rain had stopped for I don't know how long. I go into my garage, slip on my shoes, and head on out our sliding back door in our kitchen. The backyard was large and fenced in, as we used to have some dogs. There was a gate in the fence just off the patio that leads to our underground swimming pool, then another that leads into the side of our yard. I exited through there and headed down to my driveway and onto the road. I was out for maybe an hour or so when I finally returned from my rather simple exercise of walking up and down the road while waving to any friendly neighbors I saw. I walked towards my side yard when I noticed that the gate I'd exited out of earlier was still open. I must have forgotten to close and secure it, I thought to myself. It was a bit windy that day, so perhaps the wind had opened it up because I'd forgotten. Oh well. I headed through the gate, through our pool area, back onto the patio, and in through the sliding glass door. Later on, as the night began to set in further, I had just finished baking and eating half of a frozen DiGiorno stuffed crust pepperoni pizza when I heard one of the fence gates slowly creaking open. Obviously frightened, I thought at first maybe it was my mom or dad coming home early. They'd always call me when they were on their way home from wherever they were at though, so that surely couldn't have been it. I ran throughout the house and locked every door and window. I waited and listened in my kitchen for any further suspicious sounds. After about 5 minutes of not hearing anything else, I thought maybe it had just been my imagination, or maybe I'd again forgotten to lock the gate on my way in and the wind had blown it open again. I decided to quickly head outside and check it out. By now, it was completely dark and cloudy, so I grabbed a flashlight out of a drawer in the kitchen and crept out the front door. Once I was out on my driveway, I shone my flashlight down the side yard towards our shed. Okay, nothing there. So far, so good. I walked down the side yard slowly and was pointing my flashlight in every direction, keeping myself aware of my surroundings. Once I finally crept up to the gate, I saw it was wide open. Must have forgotten to lock it again, I thought to myself. I face-palmed. I shut it and locked it, then turned around to head back towards my driveway. All of a sudden, though, I noticed something out of the very corner of my eye in the darkness. My heart dropped as I shined my flashlight quickly towards my backyard and caught a glimpse of the backside of somebody walking behind my shed. From what I saw, I could make out that this was a person with dark hair wearing a black hoodie and sweatpants, and they appeared to be carrying something in their left hand. I could just barely make out what appeared to be the blade of a knife or some sort of small, sharp instrument. At this point, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know whether to confront this person or go inside and call my parents. I stood frozen for a few seconds, hand trembling, as I finally decided to call my mom. After 2 rings, she picked up. "Hello, John. You need something, sweetheart?" she asked. I felt a bit more comfortable now. "Yeah, Mom, I think there's someone in our yard," I said, taking a deep breath. My mom gasped, and her voice got a bit frantic. This was the first time something like this had ever happened. "Where are you now?" I continued looking out towards my shed, now lit up by the flashlight. I could no longer see the person anywhere. "I'm out on the driveway. I heard the gate open and went outside to check it out. I saw someone. He was walking toward the back side of the shed and carrying something. I think it's a knife or something like that. My mom gasped again, and this time I heard my dad ask what was wrong. She told him what happened as I stood there and eyed for any movement. We're heading home right now. Call 911. Don't go chasing him or anything stupid like that. All right, Mom, I'm going back inside right now. After exchanging our farewells, I turned around to rush back into the house. Once I turned the corner to head back to my front door, though, I saw somebody walking down the road right in front of me. My heart sank as I stood there in shock, ready to flash my flashlight at whoever this was. The person stopped walking and stood still for a couple of seconds before slowly turning their head in my direction. They must have heard me walking as well. I instinctively whipped the light up and shined it at the person's face. It was a male, I don't know how old, dressed in a black zip-up hoodie and black sweatpants. No doubt it was the same person I'd seen behind my shed. I could only see one of his eyes, as the other was completely covered by something. He looked at me with this blank, expressionless face. It almost felt like he was glaring directly into my soul. This time, I didn't see his knife, but he did have his hand in his hoodie pocket. Without a single word or facial gesture, he slowly began to walk backward before turning around and continuing down the road. After a few seconds, I ran up the road in front of my house and peered down it. I didn't see him anymore. He must have entered someone else's yard. I ran back inside and waited for my dad and mom to get home, as I called police in the meantime. Once a state trooper arrived, I told them everything, from the gate being fondled with to the encounter I'd had with him in front of my house. The trooper told me there had been several calls in the past few months about a person matching that description I gave them, being spotted in several different areas, acting very suspiciously. That interested me greatly, I must say. I tried to ask him more about it, but he declined to answer. Once my parents arrived, they talked with the trooper a bit before he finally left. Afterwards, my parents and I talked about what happened before sitting down to watch a movie, which made us all fall asleep together. Nothing much changed after that night, though. I still live here, and my parents still let me stay home alone, but we've gotten a home security system just in case, and I'm more vigilant whenever I'm by myself. Have you ever been to one of those corn mazes in the fall? My county does them in October, in lieu of haunted houses. I've always sort of liked them, but I think I like haunted houses much better. I mean, it sort of makes sense why ghosts would haunt a house, but I could never figure out why a ghost would hang out in a corn maze, unless they were killed in a cornfield or something, but I digress. I stopped going to them when I was a teenager. However, one October, when I was hanging out with my friends at night and drinking a bit, we started talking about the local corn maze. I claimed that I had never found them scary and didn't understand why anyone would do so. Well, my buddy Todd then dared me to go through the corn maze at night by myself. Since I wasn't scared at all. I told him the corn maze was closed. He laughed and asserted it would not be very difficult to break into such a place. I knew in my heart that he was right, so I had to put my money where my mouth was and take that dare. We hopped into Todd's pickup truck. There were 4 of us, and we drove out to the corn maze. It was about midnight midnight when we finally got there. Now, I guess this is an obvious statement, but it was so different seeing the maze in the nighttime than the daytime. It actually looked so much creepier. It didn't have any of the people dressed up as fake monsters either. That made the atmosphere even more spooky. It looked abandoned and dark, so Todd told me that the dare was on. I had to walk the entire maze. He would drive his truck to the other side where the exit was and await me there. He and my friends had to promise me, though, that they weren't going to sneak into the maze and try to scare me. I wasn't exactly sure how likely they were to keep that promise, though. I slowly made my way into the maze. It's important to note that the walls of the maze were large enough to not be able to see over them. Of course, it didn't take long before I began hearing noises in the maze. I knew it had to be Todd. He'd broken his promise and was following me. At first, it seemed to be just light footsteps, but after a while, someone began moving the corn stalks on the other side of the wall. Several times, I called out to Todd and told him to knock it off. I tried to let him know I was not scared, and nothing he was going to do was going to scare me either. I wasn't completely confident, though. I'll have to admit it was bravado getting me through that maze so far. With the added noises, it was indeed very, very freaky. I did my best not to let it show, though. My ego was determined to make it through the entire maze without going back or flinching. Then I'd confront him at the end. It was then that I heard Todd call out to me. He talked in an almost amusing, high-pitched voice. I can still remember the things he said. They were comical as well as scary. "I'm opening my knife," Todd said in a sing-song manner. I ignored him. "I think I'll cut a few corn stalks," Todd said. I still ignored him. "I'm gonna throw them at you to let you know I really have a knife," Todd told me. I still ignored him, but all of a sudden I was hit in the head by the cornstalk. Now I'm thinking about cutting your face off. I tried to ignore him, but there was something about this voice that last time that unnerved me. All the bravado flooded away from my system, and I didn't know how much longer the maze was. I knew that Todd was somewhere behind me, so I took off and started running through the maze. I could tell that Todd was running after me too, so I ran as quickly as I could, cutting each corner as closely as possible. As I made my way through the maze, Todd continued to taunt me. Once I got out and was no longer so freaked out by the atmosphere, I saw the exit. I ran out of the maze. I burst out from it sprinting. My stomach almost fell out of my body when I saw Todd and my two other friends standing right there in front of his pickup truck, which meant he couldn't have been the guy in the maze following me. I ran up to them and told them to get in the truck right now. At first, it seemed like Todd thought I was just trying to scare him, but when he looked behind me, he suddenly turned around and began sprinting. We hopped into the truck. He started it and took off. I caught my breath, and I told Todd that someone had been following me through the maze with a knife. He responded, and I'll never forget what he said. "I know. I saw him coming out of the maze behind you when you told us to run." I had a freaky encounter when I was in high school. Although this happened many years ago, I still remember it just as if it had occurred yesterday. It wasn't the first day of fall, but it was definitely the first day that felt like fall, if you know what I mean. I was in school on a Monday. I lived in town, so I walked to and from school. Upon first stepping outside, I noticed two things. The leaves had started falling from the trees, and there was a cold breeze in the air. The sky was overcast as well. I went back inside and quickly grabbed my jacket, knowing I would need it today. It was such an odd day. It's almost like I didn't really feel like I'd woken up at all. I guess that's the only way I can describe how I felt. Everything was just off. I couldn't really pay attention in class, and spent almost all class looking out the window, watching the leaves fall down. I felt like it was going to rain soon. The clouds in the sky were very dark, and the wind was picking up during the day. It was during my 5th class that I noticed someone. It wasn't unusual to see people walking along the sidewalk in front of the school during the day. What was unusual, though, was to see someone pacing back and forth in front of the school, if pacing was even the correct word for this. There was a tall man, very slender. He was dressed almost like a hiker. He had on boots and a backpack and just kept walking back and forth. He'd walk from one end of the sidewalk of the block my school was on, turn around and walk completely back to the other side. He just repeated this over and over and over, several times. All the way till I was done with the class even. I found it so odd and even a bit creepy. It put images of him as a possible sexual predator into my head. I assumed if this was really the case, though, he wouldn't be making it so obvious. I tried to just put him out of my mind as I went to lunch. He could just be a purely normal guy having a walk to think to himself or something. The first class after my lunch was also in front of the school, though. Sure enough, when I went to my class, the pacer was still there. He was walking back and forth on the block looking at the school. I was surprised, as I really had put him out of my mind. I would have thought that anyone else who had been pacing in front of the public school for hours on end would have been talked to by a passing police car or something by now. That must have meant they'd decided there was nothing wrong with the guy. I was still disconnected from the day, though. This time I was less daydreaming, though, and wondering what this strange man was up to, if he indeed was up to anything at all. I just couldn't get it out of my head for the entire time I was in that class. I don't think I heard a single word my teacher said. When it ended, I still couldn't get that weird person out of my head. I went off to my next class, still wondering. After school, I had play practice. I stayed later than most of the other students to help another actor practice his lines. By the time I was ready to leave, the sun had already begun to set. The school looked completely deserted. There was a light mist in the air as well, although it had not yet rained. I left out the side door of the school and walked on the sidewalk that led back behind the school. I had to walk that way in order to get home. It was quite damp out, and the leaves were blowing hard in the wind. I knew I'd feel a lot better when I got home. Only, when I looked up ahead of me, I saw what looked like the very same guy from earlier. The pacer was somehow still around, and he was walking on the sidewalk in my direction. I began to feel a little bit uneasy. Still, though, I realized this guy didn't know me or anything. He also didn't acknowledge me, and didn't seem to look at me as I walked on. For some reason, he still made me feel very uncomfortable. I couldn't explain exactly why. I felt something so off about this guy, I decided to avoid him. I went slightly out of my way, and turned on the street that led into the neighborhood beside the school. I wanted to walk around the block and get back to the street I was on further down. I was still feeling something uncomfortable, though. I felt like I was being watched or followed, perhaps. It was irrational, but I felt it so strongly. I turned around and looked behind me to check, only to be surprised that the pacer had turned down the very same street I was on and was now following me. I chalked it up to a coincidence. He surely just happened to turn down the same street as me. When I got to the end of the block, I turned right. When I'd gotten halfway up the street, I once again felt a need to look over my shoulder. Sure enough, he was still right behind me. There was a faint possibility it was still a coincidence. However, when I made a third turn and headed back to the street the school was on, he turned again. That showed me he was following me. Then, when the street came up, I turned halfway down the block and looked over my shoulder, only to see he was indeed following me. I decided to run back to the school. As soon as I began to run, however, I slipped forward on a wet leaf and fell face first onto the sidewalk. I got knocked silly. Suddenly, I felt someone grab me from behind. Immediately, I knew it was that pacing guy. I tried to pull away, but he kept a solid grip on my arms. I was basically still on my hands and knees anyway. Then, the guy started whispering to me that I needed a new arm. I didn't know what he meant, but he was really hurting me. I wasn't a weakling, though, and once I'd finally returned to my bearings, I was able to flip over and kick him away from me with my feet. The man didn't even fall over. He just stopped trying to pick me up. Then he grabbed his backpack and held it in front of him. Opening it up, I smelled the most revolting stench I'd ever smelled in my entire life. He reached into it. However, before he pulled anything out of it, the porch light of the house we were in front of came on. A man rushed out of the house with an aluminum baseball bat in his hand and threatened the man to get away from me. It took a few moments, but he eventually put his backpack on and turned around and left. Once he was gone, the man from the house came out and helped me up. He even gave me a ride home. I never saw that pacing man again. I always wondered what he meant about needing a new arm, and what he could have been reaching for in that backpack. I guess when I was growing up, I was a bit of an unusual kid. I didn't really like people too much, so I spent a lot of time by myself. My parents didn't exactly like me hanging out around the house by myself all the time, so they would always encourage me to get out of the house and do things. They pestered me enough that eventually I did do it, but the only thing they really accomplished was getting me to take walks by myself. After a while, I did appreciate it though. I'd honestly begun to enjoy my lonely little walks. I would walk sometimes for hours and hours, and just use the time to think about whatever was on my mind. Those days, I'd have to say that my favorite walks were in the fall. I could watch the leaves falling from the trees forever. I loved the sound of the dry and already fallen leaves crackling under my feet too as I walked. I liked having it cool enough that I had to wear a jacket, but not cold enough that I had to wear a coat. Most of all though, I liked that there weren't as many people out as compared to the summertime. Before I go on, I should explain to you a cognitive distortion that I suffer from. It's called mind reading. I know how that might sound, but if you're unfamiliar with what cognitive distortions are, they're mistakes in your thinking that lead to faulty assumptions. Mind reading is when you assume you know what everyone else is thinking of. For example, you walk by a crowd of people and hear them laughing, and you make the immediate assumption they're laughing about you. That's mind reading. More often than not, it's also completely incorrect. When I was 13 years old, I was out for a walk in the fall. I had been walking around for a very long time that day. Normally, I'd try to get back home before it gets dark, but I got way too lost in my thoughts on this day. Before I knew it, the sun was already going down, so I had to head home and real quick. I was on the other side of town, walking down Central Street, which was the main road in town. All of a sudden, I saw someone walking in my direction up in the distance. It was a very big guy, wearing some raggy clothes. As usual, my mind went somewhere it didn't really need to go. I immediately thought the worst of this person. I wanted to cross the street, actually. This was a normal response for me if I saw anyone walking in my direction. I did my best to resist, but the closer we got to each other, the more uncomfortable I felt. I knew that I had to take what was in my mind and do my best to shoo it away, because I knew there was no real danger here. But as we got closer and closer, my mind started to play tricks on me. When we were no more than a block away from each other, I guess my anxiety about it got the better of me. I quickly turned and ducked down a side street, intending to cut through it to get all the way home. I felt bad for failing, but I felt better that I was now alone again in the street. I had ducked down. It was very dark. I lived in a pretty small town, so once you got off the Central Street, you pretty much have very little light left. Like I mentioned, I felt better being by myself though. I began thinking I had been jumping to conclusions. Actually, I felt a little bit bad about judging that random person. I didn't even really know them to begin with. I should have been able to walk past the guy. I was in thought about the incident, thinking about what I could do better in the future, when I suddenly felt someone touch me from behind on the shoulder. It wasn't an aggressive touch, but it did make me jump. Before I could turn around, I heard a voice whisper to me, "I'd love to buy all your fingers off you." I quit turning around and took off down the street. I really didn't need to see who was saying that to me. Whoever had whispered in my ear seemed to make no effort to hold me back either. I never looked back. I just ran and didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street that my house was on. At that point, I finally turned around. I didn't see anyone there though. I never got a good look at who it was that whispered that to me. I can only assume it was the guy I'd seen on the street. Perhaps sometimes mind reading can be useful, but who knows? My mom was a single parent of 3 kids. We were pretty poor, so she worked pretty much 24/7. This meant that as kids, my siblings and I spent a lot of time home alone. Well, this story happened when I was 14. at the very start of summer. My older sister had moved out by then, and my little brother got sent to stay with my grandpa for the summer. This meant I was home alone from about 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. every weekday. I didn't really mind too much though. I spent most of that time playing Neopets or watching awful daytime TV. Well, one day, I had not long woken up, and my mom had gone to work hours earlier. It was around 12 p.m. or so. I got up to make some food, let my dog outside, and settled down on my bed to eat a bit. I remember watching Rock of Love, and remember exactly the bit of show I was watching too when this happened, even though it happened so many years ago. As I was sitting there watching, I heard a loud smack on my window. My window was a double window that needed 2 blinds, 2 curtains, etc. This meant there was a tiny gap where you could see through the very middle of them, where they didn't quite touch together. I saw a shadow along with that sound. I also heard some logs falling down. Outside my window, there was a pile of firewood for the winter. I got up and walked over, thinking perhaps a branch or something had smacked against it, and that's when I saw it. A huge handprint left on my window right where the tiny gap was between my blinds. I freaked the fuck out. I couldn't even breathe. I was so scared. I called 911 and then my next door neighbor, who was a family friend. He ran over as soon as I said what happened, and he found the guy there still, a man in his mid-40s, sprinting out of my backyard into the street ahead. My neighbor tried to keep him there until the police arrived. When they got there, I told them what happened. They looked into the guy to see if he had a past, but nothing seemingly came up. He had been dating and living with another neighbor 3 doors down from my house for a few months. When asked what he was doing at my window, he told us he was never there. He was just looking for something. I don't remember his exact excuse. I just remember him saying it happened to be in my backyard. The police got a statement from him, and the neighbor who caught him and myself thought it would help to get him put away or something. I know, it's stupid, but I was a teen. I didn't know any better. They just let him go and didn't do anything. I waited to hear from them regarding next steps we could take, but I never got another reply. From then on, my anxiety was awful. I had motion lights set up outside my window as well, making sure I was never sleeping alone too. But it wasn't enough. I could never rest. Now I felt like I was constantly being watched everywhere. Who knows, maybe I could have been. How did this guy know I would be home alone? What did he want to find me doing? I felt so unsafe. Fast forward 2 months later. I'm staying with my best friend who lived across the street from me, and we were both in the shower. We saw a shadow walk up to the bathroom window. It was glazed over, so you couldn't see anything properly. I wiped off some of the steam, and who do I see? That guy from my window the other time, running away from the bathroom as I popped it open. I told my friend who it was, and we both freaked out together. We called the cops again, and again they did nothing. Worst part was, no one even believed me, minus the guy who'd found him the first time. My mom told me I was too fat for a guy to want to creep on me, and that I was just being dramatic. Nothing happened to the guy. He did this multiple times after, and I have to wonder how many others he did it to as well. The woman he was living with had a very young daughter at the time too. It still haunts me, though I guess it shouldn't. It just scares me. We can go on with our lives, and someone could be watching and waiting to prey on us, and we would never know. What would he have done that night if he hadn't accidentally knocked the firewood logs over? I'll never know. This story isn't so much about Halloween itself, as it is about something that happened to me on Halloween night. I was 16 years old at the time. My family lived in a pretty affluent neighborhood. I always enjoyed Halloween even when I was too old to go trick-or-treating. Our trick-or-treating was always very amazing. Tons of children from my own neighborhood and other neighborhoods around town would all come to the area in the grand search for candy. My family always gave out full-sized bars, so we were always pretty popular. Well, this night it wasn't as great as it had been before. My parents and younger brother were out of town, and unfortunately, at around 3 in the afternoon, I began to get a stabbing migraine headache. I suffered from these quite often, and I knew when this one hit, it was going to be a real doozy too. I'd probably miss the entire trick-or-treating event. I didn't want the kids in the neighborhood to go without candy, but I also didn't want them knocking on the door when I had such a bad headache. I went out and grabbed the candy bowl. I put it out on the porch with a sign out there. No one was home. Each kid can take 1 bar from the huge bowl. I also wrote that no one was home, so don't ring the doorbell if the bowl was empty. There was an obvious security camera that would ensure each kid only took 1 bar. I felt bad about doing that, but if you've ever had a severe migraine, you'd know exactly how I was feeling. The best thing I could do would be to get some solid sleep. Hopefully when I woke up in the morning, I wouldn't be hurting so bad anymore. The kids were very respectful. I woke up several times, but it wasn't because anything the kids were doing. They weren't being too loud or anything. I just woke up randomly. I looked over at the clock and then promptly fell right back asleep. The night crawled by before I knew it, and it was dark outside. Not too long after that, I woke up. I looked over at the clock and saw it was past trick-or-treating time. I dozed in and off after that. My headache hadn't quite gone away yet, but it was getting better each time I woke up. When I woke up again, I tried to turn at the clock, only to realize that I couldn't move, even though my migraine was so much better. I had a groan inwardly, as I realized what must be happening in addition to my migraines was a bout of sleep paralysis. It seemed like right then it decided to strike. I knew it would be best to just close my eyes and pray I could go back to sleep, but I couldn't do so right away. I was beginning to feel panicky, because when I had hallucinations, they were awful. They were auditory as well, so closing my eyes wasn't going to immediately solve the issue. Still, I tried to close them as much as possible, and prayed I'd just fall back asleep really quickly. As I lay down there though, I heard something. It was a creaking-like noise, as if someone was slowly opening my bedroom door. Rather than look though, I closed my eyes even tighter. When the noise didn't quit, I knew I wouldn't be able to fall asleep if I was still thinking about it, so I opened my eyes just to take a peek. My heart rate increased immediately as I saw something by the door. The door was a bit open, and there was something looking into the room at me. It appeared to be some strange goblin-looking creature. The only thing I could compare it to were the Gamorrean, those green pig-like guards that work for Jabba the Hutt. Yeah, nerdy enough to know what they were called. This creature was looking through the partially open door at me. In fact, even though it was pretty dark, I could tell that we were looking each other right in the eyes. Slowly, the creature opened the door and cautiously approached me. I felt my breathing accelerate, and I had to keep telling myself this was not real. As it got closer, I decided to close my eyes. Either I would fall back asleep or keep hearing noises, but at least I wouldn't have to look at this anymore. I still heard the creaking noises all around me, as though they were circling me around the room. After a while, I heard the steps walk back towards the door. I only knew they were gone because I heard the noise of the door closing once again. I opened my eyes a bit and looked around the room. I was still unable to move, but the monster was finally gone. After a while, I was able to fall back asleep. The next time I woke up, the sleep paralysis was fully gone, along with my migraine as well. I got up and went to grab a glass of water. I was shocked to find that as I walked into the living room, someone had clearly broken into our house. We had obviously been robbed as well. Things were overturned everywhere, and multiple things were missing. This must have happened when I was sleeping, I thought. I went and called the police. As I mentioned, we lived in a pretty upscale neighborhood. We had security cameras. When the police took them and looked at them, they confirmed that the person who'd robbed us was dressed up like a green pig guard from Return of the Jedi. In fact, he was apparently so confident in his disguise he'd even waved to the camera before breaking into my home. The sign I'd left for trick-or-treaters told him nobody was home, so I guess that's why he'd targeted our house. The monster I thought was created by my mind during sleep paralysis was a real person who had been in my bedroom walking around me for several minutes. The police never caught him either. I guess his costume was just that good. When I was 12 years old, I was getting to that age when my friends began thinking we were getting too old to go out and trick-or-treat. I always loved doing it though, so I wasn't about to completely give it up before I was ready to. Fortunately, although my other buddies kept talking about not going out anymore, they ended up being all talk mostly. Trick-or-treating to them was also just an alibi. They also wanted to do another great Halloween tradition of playing pranks on everyone. We got into our costumes, got our bags, and hit some houses pretty quickly. My friends were also a bit rude to some of the people who gave us candy. They would make sarcastic comments about how lousy the candy was, and one of my friends even told an old woman her candy was so awful he was gonna come back and egg her house later. I was extremely embarrassed each time they did something like that, but they were my friends, so I didn't tell them to quit. Trick-or-treating lasted about 4 hours in my town. My friends and I hit it early, and only went around for about an hour. After that, they were really in the mood to go out and find the true fun in Halloween. Horror. First, we went and hung out in the graveyard for a little while. It didn't last long because there were a lot of older teenagers out there drinking beer. I remember my friend Aaron went up and actually asked them to give us one. The guys told us to get the hell out of the cemetery before they kicked our asses all throughout it. We moved on. They had been talking plenty about egging some houses, but they couldn't do that till the trick-or-treating was over. We had to find something else to keep us busy in the meantime. The teenagers had killed our cemetery plans, so we went out and searched for something else that could be scary. And that was when a friend of mine suggested we go to a house I think every neighborhood has. You know, that house. All the kids talk about it as if there were something scary there. Ours was an abandoned house on a corner. The kids always told the story that a father went crazy in the house and murdered his entire family before shoving them down the garbage disposal. Ever since then, no one wanted to live there, so the house had stayed empty. It was a source of much horror throughout the year, not just on Halloween. Kids our age would normally dare each other to go up to it, or go inside it, or anything like that. Most kids would either do it and run away, or they would chicken out. We had all sorts of stories of what would happen to those kids, and we thought they were true back when we were young. It was down a dark, dead-end street. I guess that only helped its reputation. We were surprised when we went to it, though. Trick-or-treating was far from over, but there were nearly no kids on that road at all. There were no teenagers, not even anyone hanging out there. Even stranger, there was a jack-o'-lantern on the porch. It didn't have a candle in it. It looked like it was already in the stages of decay, but someone had definitely put a jack-o'-lantern on the porch of that house. "Hey, Bobby," my friend Mark addressed me. "I dare you to go smash that pumpkin." I can't even begin to tell you how much I did not want to do that. I didn't want to go up to the house at all during the daytime, much less in the dark on Halloween night. I also didn't want to be marked by my buddies for the rest of my life either, though. When your friends dare you to do something like this, you get pressured to do it pretty badly. Slowly, I walked up to the house. My knees were shaking. I was sure my friends could even see it from behind me. I just wanted to turn and run away, but I knew I couldn't do so. The pumpkin was sitting right up the staircase on the opening to the porch. The rest of the porch had a 2-foot-tall fence blocking it from view. This was not exactly a comforting thing to me. I'll let you know, I imagined some person, or even a monster, crouched down on the porch just out of view, waiting for me to ascend the stairs so it could grab me. Despite these thoughts, my friends egged me on, so I walked up the steps, grabbed the pumpkin, raised it up, and was about to smash it. That was when I thought I should probably look around the porch and see if anyone really was up there with me. I looked over to the right of me and froze immediately. Something sure was on the porch with me, but it was not a monster. It was a body. A body tied up in a chair. I assumed it was dead. I screamed and threw the pumpkin, smashing it down. My friends all cheered for me and rushed up to the porch with me. When they looked over at what I'd seen, though, all 5 of us took off running down the street as quickly as we could. We booked it over to George's house, as he was the closest to us. We told his dad, who didn't believe us at first, but we insisted. He called the police. When the police arrived, they didn't find the body on the porch, but upon entering the house, they found it in there, which means somebody had moved it in the short time after we ran away. It was a real body, too, which also means we hadn't been alone when we were there. Whoever removed that body had to have been in the house or close by. I wonder how close I'd been to becoming another victim. I grew out of things like trick-or-treating really quickly. I think I stopped going out when I was around 10 or so. Instead, I stayed home and tried to find other things to do. By the age of 13, I'd begun going out with my friends on Halloween night. We didn't do anything like egging houses or stuff like that. We just walked around the neighborhood and chatted a bit, did things that were fun together. By the time I was 15, my friend George was able to get beer from his father, so he'd always bring it out to go with him. We'd go out drinking. We were always able to find somewhere to drink in peace. Our favorite place was this old abandoned house that was extremely easy to get into. We weren't able to do this anymore when I turned 17, though. Whoever owned the property the house was on had decided to go ahead and demolish it, so we had to find a new place to hang out on Halloween night. My friend suggested we go and drink beer at the local cemetery instead. I was a bit hesitant, not because I found the cemetery scary in any way, though. I just thought it was kind of disrespectful to the dead. Still, though, either we were going to the cemetery or we were not going to find a new place. I don't know why, but I assumed the cemetery would be filled with other teenagers or kids hanging around. You know, people like to hang out and scare each other and themselves on Halloween, but we didn't really see anyone there. We looked around and eventually found a good area and settled down to drink together. I was really on edge, though. I mean really on edge. Even the beer didn't help me. There was just something about walking in, sitting on people's graves that didn't sit well with me. The beer wasn't helping me to feel any better about my guilt. The rest of my friends didn't appear to be bothered at all, though. Hell, my friend Jim even leaned up against a gravestone while we chatted. We got pretty loopy, and when we did, I thought I'd begun to hear noises, as if someone else was walking around the cemetery. I asked my friends if they had heard anything, but no one else said they did. They told me it didn't really matter much anyway. It was Halloween, so of course some other kids were going to be hanging around there. That was when Jim got the ingenious idea that he was going to try and scare whoever happened to be there. If in fact there really was someone out there at all. We all got quiet and listened. Sure enough, it sounded like someone else was walking around out there. It sounded like they were trying to be quiet too. Jim had us all creep over to this tomb. His idea was that when whoever it was came around the corner, we would all jump out at once and scream at them. Yeah, it was a lame idea, but we were all pretty buzzed by that point anyway, so we weren't really at our creative peak there. We still figured it would give the person the shock of their life for a second though, so we hid. Soon enough, we heard the footsteps coming ever closer to the tomb. Jim was prepared to jump out. We waited, and when we knew whoever it was walking just around the corner, Jim jumped around the corner of the tomb first. He screamed boo, and then he gasped. We saw someone had grabbed Jim. We looked around the corner, and a big hillbilly-looking man twice the size of any one of us had his hands around Jim's throat. George and I did our best to beat on the guy to get him to let go of Jim, but the man was made of iron or something. We tried to get him to let go, but he was way too strong even for all of us combined. We got worried with how bad he was choking and shaking Jim by the throat. We were sure he was going to die. I did the one and only thing I could think of. I held my back leg as if I was going for a 60-yard field goal and kicked the man square in the crotch. Scariest thing is, the man didn't even let go. I had to kick the man again several times before he finally let go of Jim. We pulled Jim up off the ground and booked it to make it out of the cemetery. I must have kicked him really hard though, because he didn't try to come after us. We called the cops after. Get this, the man worked in the cemetery. He was making his rounds, making sure kids weren't hanging out there since it was Halloween night. When he saw us, he decided to teach us a lesson. He did get arrested though, because even though we were trespassing, the force he used against us was extremely excessive. You could see giant hand marks around Jim's neck. A doctor said he was lucky he didn't experience a crushed larynx. To start this story, it should be said I lived in a very small town before my recent move. I'm a young woman in my early 20s. This was back in September, and I'd actually just gone to get my license renewed from turning 21, the very day this happened. That night, my phone was dead when I happened to get a flat tire. I started walking back towards my work to get a ride or a phone to call someone. Halfway through the maybe 4-mile walk, a big black truck went past me. Then, 10 seconds later, a ways up the road, pulled off backwards to the left. Immediately I knew this was going to be bad news, so I got my keys between my fingers as a weapon. As I approached the truck, I looked into it on my left, trying to scope the situation out. Then, to my right, I heard a man's voice call out, "How are you tonight?" I looked over only to see a tall, pot-bellied, dopey-looking redneck. He was obviously fucked up on something. My guess is pain pills. He didn't smell like alcohol, and didn't have the look of a meth head either. To my immense surprise, he was also naked from head to toe. Not even a sock or a shoe on his foot. Oh, and he was masturbating as he walked toward me. I said I was fine, just taking a walk. I refused to give him any information. My heart was racing, and my adrenaline was pumping. My fight or flight was engaged, and I chose manipulation, which is essentially fighting with your mind. I was in flats, so flight was out of the question. The man approached closer to me. "Don't touch me," I said. "Come on, I'm not going to hurt you." He reached out to grab me, still dopey grin on his fucked up face. Other hand still doing his biz. I punched at his stomach with my key hand, and he laughed. He asked me if I saw anything I liked. No sir, I just want to get going." His face contorted in confusion. "You want to go?" he said in a very angry tone. He then looked at me, threw his arm forward and said, "Well, go then!" I stepped backwards to avoid his shove and fell out of my shoe, quickly calculating how to get it back without taking my eyes off him. He screamed at me. I snatched it off the ground and started running with it in my hand. I was going quickly as he called after me, "You got some nice titties, girl," wanting to keep him distant and placated without looking back. I said, "Thank you, have a good night, sir." I implied to him the conversation was over. He kept chasing after me though. In the same spirit as the last time, I yelled back, "Have a good night." I then snuck a peek backward and saw his stupid naked ass now walking back to his truck, stumbling over the gravel. I quickly snatched up my other shoe off my foot, rather than try to put the other one back on. I immediately ran to the first house I saw with cars at it. I decided the evil I didn't know was better than the one I did. I banged on the door and a man answered. I was in shambles, trying to explain to a half-asleep Good Samaritan what had happened. He let me in, and his wife came out and sat with me. I called my ex to explain where I was and what had happened. When the police came, they took my statement and took me to work to get a ride. Nothing else happened after that, and they never found the man either. For a while, I was terrified I'd see him appear at the Taco Bell where I worked, but that was hands down the creepiest thing that ever happened to me, because A, everything I just said, and B, it took me 15 minutes to walk to where he was parked. He waited that long. It only took him 10 seconds, though, to see me walking alone at midnight and try to take advantage of the situation. That's what fucked with me the most about it. He just waited there like a fucking predator. I don't know why there seem to be so many scary stories that take place out in the country. I don't know if it's because there's less people around in general, or because it's more quiet and there's less light. I mean, even I have a story that's terrifying that took place out in the country. When I grew up, my parents had this really large piece of land. It was all hills and trees and beautiful countryside. Both of my parents were hunters too. I always think it's funny to tell people about that. My dad died before she did. But even when that woman was in her 40s, 50s, or 60s, she would still take her gun out and go hunting. Growing up in a family like that, it was pretty much expected I learn how to hunt too. My dad would take me out at a very young age to teach me. At first, I didn't really like it, you know. Little kids don't exactly love killing animals. I got used to it though, and as I got older, I was not only okay with it, it became something I sort of enjoyed doing. We never just hunted for sport though. We did it for food and to put food on the table. Anything I killed, I was expected to bring home for that same reason. Because I wasn't the biggest guy, even when I was a teenager, that meant I didn't concentrate on big things like deer or anything like that. I was very fond of squirrel though. Anyway, I was going coon hunting one night when I was 15 years old. I realized the thought of eating coons might throw people off nowadays, but coon hunting was a pretty big thing where I was raised. When I went coon hunting, I generally started out in the early evening, and then went into the night. I always stayed on the land that my dad owned too. I never strayed onto property that wasn't ours. I also preferred to do all of my hunting alone. I never went with my parents or my brothers or anything. It was just the sort of thing I felt better doing alone. I took my air rifle, which was a present I got when I was 13 years old, and my favorite dog Bruno, and went out to do some hunting. For those of you who don't know much about coon hunting, it's mostly a nighttime thing, although some people will attempt to do it during the day. That always brings less success though. Normally, you let your dog loose on a trail and then tree the raccoon. Once the raccoon is in the tree, you then shoot it. I was always comfortable hunting at night. No one instilled in me a fear of the dark, monsters, or the supernatural. My mind was always solely on the business at hand. I wasn't in any hurry in the early evening to find anything though. I didn't let Bruno just loose and chasing after them right away. I liked strolling out in the woods with him. Bruno was a great dog at this too. He would always follow right beside me as I was out walking. He was still kept on a strong leash though. When he would be raring to go, he would definitely be hard to control. He followed commands really well. In my opinion, was the best hunting dog we ever had. The evening soon turned into night, as I expected it would, before anything happened. Fortunately, I had brought a strong flashlight with me. Although I picked this night because the moon was full, big and bright, and I saw great in the dark, I didn't need the flashlight often, and Bruno didn't need the light at all. His big nose brought us to everything we were looking for. I was trying my best to be aware of everything that was around me though. I had been hunting enough to drown out all the cricket and frog sounds. Bruno wasn't being very active this night, so I was pretty sure there were no coons around at all. That wasn't a huge surprise though. They weren't always out on our property. After a while, he started pulling on his leash. It seemed he wanted to go after something. I hadn't seen anything myself, so I turned my flashlight on. I kept on searching around, hoping to catch the distinctive flash of yellow in the coon's eyes, but I didn't see it. Even so, I was about to unleash him and let him go, but something stopped me. I think that everything seemed eerily quiet for me in that moment. Don't get me wrong, there were still the sounds of the night as I was used to, but I wasn't really hearing them. With Bruno pulling, something had to be out there somewhere, but I don't know, something was off to me. Normally, I would have released him right away. And then I noticed it, something I had never heard before. I heard the coons chittering and screaming and making all sort of noises in the distance, but this sound sounded like many of them together screaming, and it wasn't the cute sound they usually make either. They all seemed to be very, very distressed about something. I could have just followed the sound of them and found them. However, I now decided to release Bruno and let him go. It would be much easier to just follow him. This time, though, I wasn't even thinking about shooting the coons. I wanted to know what was making them make all these noises. I ran and followed Bruno as he ran toward the sounds. I was shining the flashlight everywhere, trying to get some sight of what could possibly be out there. And finally, I did. I got the flash of yellow, which let me know I had spotted a treed raccoon, but for some reason, I didn't take out my rifle to shoot at it. I wanted to know what was going on here. As I got closer, I noticed something shocking. There was a man, probably the same age as I was, on the ground. He looked like he might have been injured or something. Bruno was at the guy's side, completely ignoring all the raccoons who were screaming and crying in the trees. It looked like the man had been pretty savagely beaten. He saw me and immediately started to plead with me for help. "He's gonna come back for me. My leg is hurt. You have to help me get out of here." I tried to calm him down, but the guy was absolutely frantic. I couldn't get him to stop long enough to tell me what was going on. From what he kept saying, though, it sounded like someone was after him. I only found out later that when the attacker saw Bruno running towards him, he'd sprinted off into the woods. I figured all the animals were screaming because they were distressed by the attack on the guy. When I asked him if I could try to help him stand, I noticed he was bloody all over, and he'd been stabbed in several places as well. As I was helping him to his feet, Bruno started barking. I didn't think anything of it at first. I mean, we were surrounded by treed raccoons. However, when I looked in the direction he'd barked in, my blood turned to ice in my veins. My flashlight shined over, only to meet the scariest-looking man I'd ever seen. He was extremely fat and had what looked like boils and scars all over him. His hair was long and unkempt, but the scariest part was the look in his eyes. He looked like he'd just escaped from an institution for the criminally insane or something. I'd never visibly seen someone so psychotic in my entire life. He had a hunting knife in his left hand, and it was covered in blood. This time he didn't flinch as Bruno ran towards him. I guess he'd decided my dog wasn't something to be afraid of. Just the look of the guy caused me to freeze for a moment, terrified beyond belief. I had never seen a horror movie before then. The closest I'd ever come to that would have been watching The Twilight Zone on television. This man looked like he'd stepped right out of an episode. Fortunately, I was an experienced hunter with instincts on my side. I knew how to quickly use my rifle, and that's what I did. I dropped my flashlight to the ground and leveled my rifle. The man was even scarier looking in the dark, but I could still see him, and I still had the gun. I didn't hesitate. I didn't wait for the guy to do anything. He had this knife, and it was very obvious he'd attacked this young man. He had that bloody knife, and it was very obvious he'd been the one who attacked the young man. I shot at the guy. I think I hit him, but I wasn't completely sure. What I do know is that after the shot, he finally moved. He ran back into the forest, and I couldn't see where he was anymore. I now had a stabbed guy, screaming animals, and a barking dog to deal with. I asked the guy on the ground if he could take the flashlight. He was still strong enough to do so, so he took it and shined it in different directions, looking for the crazy man as we went along. We couldn't see him anywhere. Don't get me wrong, not seeing him was somewhat of a relief. I didn't exactly want to go after the guy in the woods. I didn't want Bruno to go after him either. All I wanted to do was get this injured guy and myself to safety. Fortunately, his legs hadn't been stabbed, so he was still able to walk. He was very fatigued though, and had to lean on me to move forward. He was frantically shining his flashlight in case the psycho came back to attack. I was sure if he did though, Bruno would alert us before it happened. All the raccoons had now calmed down for the most part. I really don't know what to think about their reaction. I mean, they may have just been distressed because they noticed two animals fighting in their vicinity. But I don't know. For some reason, it almost seemed like they were screaming to try and get help for this hurt guy. Maybe they were trying to scare the crazy guy off or something. I don't know. What I do know is they led Bruno and I to the scene and saved this guy's life. Getting home was long and terrifying. I was expecting the man to pounce out of the woods at every moment. Fortunately though, he did not try to attack again. The entire time I could feel him watching though. I could feel his crazy eyes on me, watching from the darkness. I was able to get the kid, who I later learned to be named Vance, back to my parents' house. We drove him to the hospital, which was a pretty long drive. I learned later that Vance had been doing the same thing as me, but he didn't have a dog with him. He was attacked out of nowhere when the crazy guy just began stabbing him for no reason. He didn't know the guy at all. It was just a completely random attack. The guy had come out of the woods from nowhere. That's when all the animals started screaming, and Bruno took off running. This happened back in the 1970s. About a month later, a dead body was found in those same woods, stabbed to death. They never caught who did it, but in my mind I knew exactly who that killer was. As for me, I decided not to hunt coons anymore after that. There was something about my experience that night that changed it for me. I couldn't bring myself to shoot them, even though I had many times before. Vance healed up fine in the end, and we ended up being friends for a while. He never went hunting again though, and I completely understand why. When I was a teenager, I liked to go over to a friend's house and have some beers with him. My family really didn't care that I was drinking. That's just sort of the way things were back then. There wasn't really a lot of things to do out where we lived, so drinking beer and chewing tobacco were things all us teen boys did. Only problem is, I didn't exactly have a car. My friend Troy had a pickup truck and he would pick me up and drive down to his house. He would normally drive me home too. Almost every guy I knew, when he was driving, would have a beer sitting between his legs. So on this night, we were drinking beers and shooting the shit. Somewhere around 1 o'clock in the morning, Troy wanted to go driving out in the hills. He liked doing that late at night, and we decided to bring his younger brother Jess with us. We were 17 and Jess was 14. I think Troy had been letting Jess have some beer that night too. So we packed into the cab of the truck with Jess in the middle. I loved driving through the hills at night, but I also knew Troy could be a bit of a dick when he wanted to be, especially when he was drinking. There were tons of different roads out there, and many of them just led to other roads into the middle of nowhere. Troy was having such a good time that he ended up driving a long way from the area we were supposed to be in. We ended up coming to this random obscure road that seemed to end in a driveway. The driveway led to an extremely old-looking shack. It looked like the kind of place a hermit would live, because it was in the middle of nowhere, and it didn't even have electricity or anything like that. Troy, of course, was very interested and wanted to check the house out. I wanted to also, but Jess was a little too scared. He was worried something bad would happen to us. I guess he wasn't as drunk as Troy and I were. We didn't pull up to the house right away. Instead, we walked up the driveway and approached the place quietly. It was dark and we couldn't see much light. We had a cheap flashlight in the truck though, and were looking around the area. The light didn't have a strong beam, and we couldn't see as well as we wished we might have. We began wondering if anyone was even living there. I mean, it was late, but there was nothing to indicate any signs of life at all. We explored around the house and even went to the backyard. Suddenly, we heard Jess screaming from the truck. We immediately stopped what we were doing and ran around to the front of the shack and to the driveway. The headlights were still shining, but that made it harder to see anything. All we could do was hear Jess yelling at something that neither of us knew what it was. When we finally got to the truck, we saw Jess struggling intensely with someone who seemed to have pulled him out of it. "Hey, get the hell away from my brother!" Troy yelled. We saw the struggle going on. The person looked up at us. Troy had been carrying the flashlight, so he shined it directly in the eyes of this guy. Rather than getting a good look at him, though, he put his arms up to block his face. I got to the guy first and grabbed him to try and pull him off of Jess. Needless to say, I was extremely shocked when the man turned around and bit a big chunk out of me. I yelled because I hadn't expected that. Before I could do anything in response, he bit me again. Troy grabbed the guy, and we were able to pull him off of Jess. Troy got bit multiple times too. The guy was extremely strong, and he kept trying to get away from us. He kept on biting us over and over. All Troy and I could do was fight back. We beat the guy over and over, until we were finally able to trip him and push him down a small hill. That gave us time to get back in the truck as he rolled down. As we got in the truck and had turned it around though, I noticed him sprinting back up on all fours. I told Troy to get the hell out of there, and he definitely did so. The man even tried to chase after us in the car for a few moments, but of course he couldn't keep up with us on foot. Jess told us he'd open the door of the truck to come after us, because he didn't like the feeling of being there alone. All of a sudden, the man had emerged from nowhere in the darkness and rushed him and bit him all over. That's when he started screaming. There was a deep bite in his neck that even drew blood. The guy had bitten him over and over as he was pulling him out of the car. We didn't exactly know what to do. We got the hell out of there. We didn't go to the hospital either. We didn't know that human bites could be dangerous. We treated them at home and never went driving down that road again. I was bullied a lot when I was younger. When I got into middle school was when it was the worst. I came from a pretty poor family, so I didn't always have the best clothes. Many were hand-me-downs, and a lot of them were worn pretty severely. Most of the bullying came from kids who lived in town. However, the country kids joined in too. Many of them were even poor like I was. I simply had the detriment of being smaller than all the other guys, so I was an easy target. I was a really good student too, so that completed the perfect trifecta of bullying. Poor, small, and smart. Even though I was smart, I hated going to school. At least when I was home out in the country, I didn't have to deal with all the bullies. I had my siblings to play with, and we got along very well. Being home was a lot nicer than being at school, which was full of testosterone-filled idiots who lived to pick on others. Summers were the absolute best. Although I don't particularly care for hot weather, I got to be away from the constant torment. There were some kids who lived down in the holler down the road from me who were jerks to me as well. However, I rarely encountered them during the summer, even though I spent a lot of my time out in the woods. One thing I really liked to do was find this area where I could meet up with the train tracks. There was a long track that ran through the country for miles and miles. A beautiful scene, too. I like to imagine myself on the train, just passing through this beautiful country setting. Occasionally, when a train would come by, I would sit up against a tree and just watch it pass. I was out there one summer day, walking along the train track and minding my own business. After a while, I saw some people up in the distance. I couldn't make out who they were, and I didn't really pay attention to them until it was too late. It turned out to be 3 kids who really bullied me bad in school. Curtis, Tom, and Billy. Here I was in the middle of the hills with nowhere in sight to get away from them. When I knew who they were, I tried to just casually walk off. I was hoping they wouldn't know it was me. I failed though. They chased after me, and I didn't get very far until they caught me. I was pretty scared I was going to get beaten up, but they didn't do that at first. They just talked like jerks and insisted I sit down and talk with them. The whole situation was weird. They wanted me to sit with them and watch when a train came. I didn't really know why, but I was glad they weren't going to beat me up. We waited and waited, and I almost thought the guys were going to be nice with me. Then we heard a train coming off in the distance though, and that's when everything happening changed drastically. The boys all grabbed me, and began pulling me down to the tracks. I tried struggling against them, but it was no good. Even one of them would have been too strong for me to resist, much less all three of them. When they'd pulled me down to the tracks, they revealed what they were planning to do. They were going to wait until the train was right there, hold my head down to the track, and let the train kill me. I was terrified, and I believed them. I struggled and tried to get free, but I knew I couldn't. I kept watching the train get closer and closer. The kids were mocking me, telling me I was about to die as I was crying. When the train finally got close, they made as if to push me down right in front of it. However, when they pushed, they all kept a firm hold of me. The push was minor. They pulled me back just in time from the tracks and let me fall down. I lay on the ground crying. I think they probably thought they had done enough, because other than mocking me, they didn't even try to beat me up or anything. They just laughed at me and eventually left. The event was scary for other reasons, though. I had no idea they weren't actually going to hurt me. But also, they had no idea their plan was really going to work. If they had messed up, I would have easily been killed. I didn't tell anyone about the incident, and I guess they didn't either. They probably thought they would get into some real trouble. As for me, I was embarrassed and didn't want anyone to know. My neighborhood had one of those corn mazes every fall. Honestly, I don't quite understand them myself. It was supposed to be a Halloween attraction, but I couldn't really ever figure out what they had to do with Halloween. It's not like it was a haunted corn maze or something. I've seen those before, but this one was not like that. It was simply a regular corn maze that you were supposed to find your way through. The maze did change every year, so it was a new challenge to go through. Although I didn't understand the point of these things, that didn't mean I begrudged others who did enjoy them, and it didn't mean I didn't enjoy them either. In fact, I loved those corn mazes. This was in spite of what happened to me the very first time I went through one, though. I was 8 years old at the time this happened. My parents didn't work a traditional workday schedule. This made things pretty easy on us when it came to going places. What I mean is that there were much more times they weren't busy that we were able to go on trips because of this. For example, if you wanted to see a movie at noon on a weekday, you could enjoy a nearly empty theater. The corn maze opened on a Wednesday. I thought this was odd somewhat. My mom took us to it that afternoon, and it was completely empty as we expected. The attendant told my mom that if we really wanted to, we could go through the maze one by one. This would make it more challenging and atmospheric. I begged my mom to let me go through it first, and I did so. Even though it was in the middle of the day, I was still quite scared. It was very creepy sneaking through the maze like that all by myself. There were many dead ends, and I hit most of them. My 8-year-old mind could get very paranoid about hitting so many dead ends. Even though I didn't give it much mind, over time my brain did start worrying about me not being able to find my way out of the maze. That's when I heard a voice. I wasn't sure exactly where it was coming from, nor what it actually said at first. It was clearly a human voice, though. I began wondering if I had taken so long in the maze that they had sent someone in to find me. Maybe it was my brother and he'd come looking for me or something. I tried to follow the voice when I heard it again. I actually followed it right into another dead end. I was about to turn around and try to find a different pathway when I finally heard the voice clearly. They were singing some song about corn. I was a little freaked out for some reason. It just seemed like a weird thing for someone to just be singing randomly in the maze. It was also scary because I couldn't tell where the voice was coming from. I wondered if it was from the other side of the corn wall or something. I asked if anyone was there. There was a long pause, and then I heard them singing again. I asked where the person talking was talking from. The only answer I received was more singing. While staring at that corn wall in front of me, though, I watched an arm come out of it. Seeing the arm emerging, I suddenly felt my eyes focus. I was now able to see there was a person crouched down in the corn hiding. He beckoned at me. Come on. I didn't know who this was, so I turned and started running. I didn't know if he was chasing after me. All I could hear were my own footsteps and my heart beating in my ears. I finally ran into my brother. He was wondering why I was so freaked out. I explained what just happened. He took me back toward the entrance of the maze, and we told the attendant that someone was hiding out there in the corn. He had also been trying to get me to walk into it with him. He went into the corn maze and checked himself, and claimed he didn't find anyone there. Still though, he was nice enough to give my parents their money back, and also insisted we were the very first customers that had shown up that day, so we had no idea how anyone had gotten in or out of the maze without him seeing them. To this day, I can still see that person in my mind, crouching in the corn and beckoning me to come towards them. I used to work in one of those haunted corn mazes. Well, technically I didn't work in one of them. The people who worked in the corn mazes were the people dressed up as monsters and ghosts. I was just the ticket taker. In addition to taking the tickets, I was also the person who cleaned up after the maze was closed down. We stayed open until midnight, so by the time we got all the people out of the maze and cleaned up after them, and closed up shop, it was usually around 1 a.m. in the morning. On this particular night the story took place. It was a night just before Halloween. We were very busy because of this. The other ticket taker had also called in sick, making me the only person who was there to do the job. I can't say I was too happy about that exactly. Although the time did go by really quickly. I barely had a chance to breathe. Before I knew it, the day was over though. The people and all the actors had cleared out. I waved to all my colleagues as they went home, and before I knew it, the once completely packed area was now empty, all except for me walking over to the maze. I realized the actors hadn't really cleaned up the maze at all. I noticed there were several food wrappers on the ground. I didn't want to leave the work for the next day, so I grabbed up a broom and one of those standing dustpans and went to clean up a bit. I have to admit to feeling a bit of a buzz as I walked through the maze. Although I had been in it by myself before, this was the first time I had done it in the middle of the night. It was eerily quiet, save for the sounds of bugs and stuff. I had a map of the maze with me, so I wouldn't get lost. I had to use the flashlight on my cell phone in order to be able to see at all. I'm not sure how long I'd been in the maze before I began to feel like I was being watched. Hell, it was a haunted corn maze. I was able to brush it off because being scared was exactly how I was supposed to feel in this scenario. The feeling didn't really go away though. It wasn't too long before I began to hear these little noises. At first, it was just simple things, like corn stalks rustling. That could have been chalked up to the wind. I also began to think I was hearing footsteps though. Very cliché. They would stop whenever I stopped walking. I chalked that one up to my imagination or an echo of something. What I couldn't brush off was the sound of a can crushing as someone accidentally stepped on it. I immediately called out to check if anyone was there and got no answer back. A few minutes later, I heard a similar noise of trash being crushed underfoot. I called out again. There was nothing but general anxiety now. It was beginning to develop into paranoia. I was sure there was someone in the maze with me. I immediately thought it must be one of the actors. It was technically Halloween now. Maybe he'd remained in the maze and didn't clean it up on purpose, drawing me into it in an attempt to scare me and prank me. I called out and told whoever it was that I would not be getting scared. I was lying just a little bit though. I was already very scared. The more intermittent noises I continued to hear, the more I called out with no answer. I began to get even more paranoid about what was going on. The joke had gone on far enough. Finally, I'd had more than enough of this. I wasn't completely finished cleaning the maze, but I decided the rest of it would have to wait till tomorrow. If it did happen to be one of the actors following me around in the maze, then I'd make them clean up in the morning. How's that for a prank? I made my way back to the entrance of the maze. I stopped hearing those noises as I went along to the exit. I went out, went and closed the ticket booth. When I was about done, I tried to quickly look back at the maze. I jumped in surprise when I saw a figure standing in the entranceway. I didn't know who it was, and by looking at the size of this person, there was no way it was any of the actors I knew. This man was much taller than any of the ones we had working. I realized he had been following me around the maze the whole time. He didn't make any moves toward me, but I didn't give him much of a chance to anyway. I had the lockbox with the ticket money in it. I figured that must have been what he was after. A weird thought struck me though. If he was after the money, why had he been following me around in the maze when I'd like an idiot left the box laying right on the ticket booth in the open? The only explanation was that he was after me. I grabbed the box and sprinted over to my car. I looked back once over my shoulder, only to see the man was now right next to the ticket booth. Unfortunately, this wasn't exactly a horror movie. The car started immediately. I pulled out and left. The following morning, I arrived at the corn maze, and I asked if anyone had been there past closing, or if they knew anyone who had. No one did. The man who was following me around that corn maze was clearly not supposed to be there. I'm not exactly sure if this story is YouTube friendly at the moment, but it is the scariest night of my life. I kid you not, this story is 100% true. I know it sounds like a horror movie, but this very well could have been something that actually was in a scary movie. Only, it could happen to anyone. My boyfriend and I are into making love secretly in public places. We have a list of places where we do it. We call it our bucket list. Anyway, one location was a cornfield. Around Halloween time, we were sitting on the couch bored, taking shots of vodka and not exactly looking forward to having kids ringing on the doorbell all night long. Halloween night was obviously a good night to get out, so we decided to visit a corn maze. We dressed in warm clothes and got on our way. We both knew how the night would end, making love in a cornfield. One more to cross off the list. We go through the maze with the different jump scares, we scream and giggle. We were having a blast together. After a while, we didn't get any more jump scares. It was very dark, and for some stupid reason, we hadn't brought our phones with us. Looking back, I think we didn't bring them so we could immerse ourselves in the Halloween spirit more. Because of this though, we had no clue what time it was, and it turns out the maze was now closed. He and I were admittedly very tipsy. We ended up going off the stupid path, out into the corn stalks. We found this wooden fence. A wooden fence which happened to be the perfect spot for my boyfriend of 3 years to bend me over. We began caressing each other's faces, putting our lips together. He pushes my skirt up and begins pulling my tights down when I hear a snap. I have severe anxiety, and I know that doesn't fit with someone who's down to do this sort of thing in public, but it's just part of who I am. I moved my hand and placed it on my boyfriend's chest, signaling for him to stop. I turned my head in the direction of where I'd heard that single snap. "Hey, did you hear that?" I whispered to my boyfriend. He replied, "No, I'm just focused on you." You know, usual boyfriend response. We were about to start up again, but I was feeling really nervous. Something didn't feel right here. I heard another snapping sound. I turned around immediately. "Okay, you can't tell me you didn't just hear that," I whispered to my boyfriend. He looked curious and concerned. "I heard it that time too." We stayed quiet, but we didn't hear anything else for 5 more minutes. We deduced it had to be a raccoon or something, and we're starting to get back to business. Now though, I started to hear some heavy breathing. "Did I wear you out already?" I jokingly expressed. "Not at all," my boyfriend replied, and that's when I realized he wasn't even out of breath. We must have been too into our activities that we didn't notice what was standing in front of us. As I looked up, I could see there was a man. He was at least 6 foot tall, dressed in a Scream costume, but instead of a knife, He held a machete. Scream was the first horror movie I ever saw, and always remained my #1 favorite movie, but not after this. I'm 5'3" and my boyfriend is 5'6", so this guy was completely towering over us. I screamed out my boyfriend's name. He stopped and looked up and yelled to follow him. I'm directionally challenged, so if I ran by myself, I would get lost for days. On the other hand, my boyfriend somehow knows where he's going at all times, so I followed him closely. His Adidas and my snow boots trekked through that corn maze. I could hear heavy footsteps following behind us. They didn't sound like they were too close, though. We rushed until we reached the gate of the corn maze. It was obviously closed since the park was closed as well. We looked back, only to see the man no longer in sight. My boyfriend helped me over the fence and climbed over himself after. We could see our car was the only car in the lot. I turned around, only to see the man now hacking away at the gate with his machete. He was actually starting to break the links. I yelled out in absolute terror. My boyfriend picked me up and started running to the car with me in his arms. He yelled at me to get in the car. We both jumped in, and he pulled out in his red Subaru. The last thing I saw was the machete-wielding ghost face bending his body through a hole in the chain-link fence he'd managed to chop away. He stood there, watching us drive away. He stood there, watching us drive away into the moonlight, waving his machete angrily in the air, as if to say we were lucky we got away. Next Halloween, I think we'll just stay home with our cats and hand out candy. I'm also never going to watch Scream ever again. For a bit of context, I need to explain how transportation works in the area where I live. So where I live, public transportation is absolute dog shit. There's only one not very reliable public bus that takes you in and out of the residential area. It's a long way walking too, so the people in this area came up with a cab sort of system. You pay by the seat, so one of the cabs fits up to 4 people. A little under a year ago, they decided to identify these cabs with a sticker and a number that states that the car is part of the cab line. The drivers are also required to have an ID that has the cab line info. Now, on to the story. A couple of times, men have tried to offer me a ride. I try my best to ignore them, but sometimes it can be a little bit scary. The part of the residential area where I live is very isolated, so not a lot of cars or people go through there. I have to walk alone from my house to the cab line and bus stop because of this. At one time, a couple of months ago, I was walking from my house to the stop, wearing my headphones, so not really paying much attention. That was my first mistake on my part. All of a sudden, a car pulled over right next to me. This wasn't that strange, really. I've been using this cab line for a while, and a lot of the drivers know me personally. If they see me, sometimes they'll pull over so I don't have to walk all the way to the stop. The driver said, "Hey, are you going to my place of destination?" I said yes and got into the car, without checking the windshield for the ID number. That was the second mistake on my part. Here is where the alarms started going off in my head. First, a lot of the cars in the line tend to be older cars with no AC. This was a newer car, so right when I got in, he locked all the doors. At this point, I finally realized this wasn't one of the cabs I knew, but instead a complete stranger. He began interrogating me over things, exactly where I lived, all sorts of things. I responded as vaguely as possible, with my heart now beating really fast. I was starting to panic, so I texted a friend my location and told him to call me ASAP. At this point, we were getting closer to the destination, and the man was not slowing down the car at all. He just drove right past my stop when the call came through from my friend. I started to talk to him like he was my boyfriend. "Hi, baby. I'm almost there, so wait for me, and we'll go together, okay?" My friend was really confused, but when the man heard my conversation, he suddenly stopped the car right in the middle of the street "Oh, sorry. I was so entertained talking to you that I almost passed by. We'll be seeing each other again." He unlocked the car and I bolted out, barely saying a word to acknowledge him. After that day, I became much more aware of my surroundings, and I tend to only get inside the cabs at the stop unless I clearly see the ID of the car or know the person inside. A couple of my friends said I was just overreacting, but that event really scared the shit out of me. Then today arrives. I was walking from my house to the stop as usual. No headphones this time though. I was about halfway there when a car started driving slowly next to me. I kept on walking, and the older man that was driving before started to talk to me through the window. "Hey, are you Alicia's daughter by chance? You live around here, right?" I responded I was not, and kept on walking. He kept on insisting though that he was my neighbor, and he would give me a ride to my destination. I replied again he had mistaken me, and I didn't want a ride from him. Mind you, my mom was not called that, and has been dead for over a decade. My grandma, that sometimes people confused as my mom, was not called that either. I began walking faster as he followed me, approaching the stop where there were more people. At this point, the man became extremely angry and started to yell at me in front of everyone. He screamed that this was the last time he would be so nice about this to me. Then he sped up and left. Finally, I got to the stop to get inside a cab, and they took me to my destination. When I got to work, I told my boss what happened. She said, "Thank God you kept on walking, you would have been kidnapped." And yeah, that was my morning today. I really need to get myself a car in case that guy comes back around. I grew up in a family with 4 boys and 1 girl. My sister was the oldest of us, and she was always left in charge of us when our parents weren't around. She tried her best to be a good babysitter, but she had 4 boys who didn't like being told what to do, so it was hard to blame her if things ever got out of hand. My parents had bought a house out in the country when my dad got a job in a new state. Unfortunately, it was a good hour or so out of town, so in the summer when my parents were off working, my sister had to deal with the 4 of us every single day. As I mentioned, we didn't exactly take kindly to being told what to do by our older sister, so we would often just leave and go exploring or fishing during the day. I was the 3rd oldest boy, or the 2nd youngest, I guess, depending on which direction you want to count from. On this one summer day when both of our parents were at work as usual, the boys all got together and grabbed our fishing poles. We went out to have a fun day. In this rural area, there was a creek about an hour's walk away from our house that we loved to frequent. We headed out early in the morning and were there before noon. When you fish in a creek, you very rarely catch anything big. On this day, though, we didn't really catch anything at all. We had spent hours trying to fish something out, but absolutely nothing was biting. It didn't take long for this to get very boring, and I decided I was just going to wander around a little bit. Only a little while later, I felt a need to go to the restroom, so I went behind a tree to do my thing. When I was just about done though, I suddenly felt a hand fall upon my shoulder. I jumped up in surprise and got a little bit of piss on my shoe. I was about to turn around and swear at whichever brother it was that startled me, but instead, when I turned around, I felt those words catch in my throat. I realized it was not any of my brothers. Instead, there was a giant redneck-looking guy standing behind me. He was absolutely huge, and wearing overalls as well. He had this gigantic beard. In shock, I tried to move away, but this behemoth grabbed me by the shoulder and held me in place. I struggled to find a way to get away from him. I tried to smack him in the balls, but he was too big for my legs to even reach. He was also able to easily keep me away from him. The worst thing of all, though, happened when he reached into his pocket and pulled out a jackknife. He quickly put the blade of the knife against my neck, and I froze, too scared to even think about doing anything. I just wished my brothers would come looking for me soon. I was too afraid to scream to get their attention, though. The man began asking me who the hell I thought I was and why I was peeing on his property. I wanted to tell him I didn't even know this was his property. I was just out with my brothers fishing, and there were no anti-trespassing signs or anything to indicate the property limits. We didn't know we weren't supposed to be there. The man pressed the knife tightly up against my neck, and I really believed I would be dying right then and there. I even felt a trickle of blood run down my neck. When the guy pushed the knife deeper into me, piercing the skin, the man began dragging me, and right when I felt I was just out of luck, I heard footsteps running in the leaves. My two older brothers, both big football jocks, yelled at the man to get his damn hands off me. My oldest brother knocked the knife out of his hand easily, and I fell to the ground. Although the man was huge, he was no match for both of my brothers together. I picked up the knife myself and stabbed the guy in his back. The second brother grabbed it from me and threatened the big guy with it further. The man got up and ran away. We hurried back to collect our youngest brother. After that, we ran home the entire way. We thought the man was going to follow us. However, we got home just fine in the end. My sister was pissed off, but when we told her what happened, she called our parents. When my dad came home, we found out the land we were on apparently belonged to the man. When my dad came home, we found out the land we'd been on belonged to the man my dad had bought the house from anyway. When we contacted him, he had no idea who this big guy could be. We described him fully, and the man who owned that property had never seen or found out who he could have been. Alright, so this incident took place in August of 2012. It was my dad's birthday, and we were taking him out deep-sea fishing for a fun activity. My dad owned a yacht, and that was big enough to do this trip. We went out far in the boat. About an hour into the boat ride, we finally stopped in a spot we thought was a good place to get a decent catch. We stopped, and within a few minutes we were set up and fishing away. We had been fishing for about 10 minutes. We'd caught 3 fish or so, I think, all pretty good size. We were interrupted, though, by a noise that sounded similar to another boat coming. We looked to the side, only to see a boat with some guy waving at us. Red flags started going off immediately. I noted at first that this guy did not look anything like a fisherman. And the way his boat looked, it was almost like something you'd find in the dump or something. I noticed he didn't have any fishing gear on him either. I was confused as to what he could be doing this far out at sea. Maybe you're thinking he was just a normal guy out on his boat during a nice ocean ride, but this guy looked like someone who would get into a lot of trouble anyway. Not that I'm trying to be rude by saying that. We waved back at him to give him a quick hello and hoped he would go away after that. Unfortunately, he didn't. He stopped his crappy boat and jumped off into the water, swimming towards our boat. Immediately, we drove away from him, leaving him behind in the wake. We went far enough where he could no longer catch up to us. It would also be quite hard for him to try and find us once he'd swum back to his boat either. That night, we all sailed back to the marina, making sure the guy had not followed us there. Everyone went to bed around 1 a.m., and I was the only one who stayed awake. I was still thinking about that man from earlier. Finally, I started to get some shut-eye for about an hour, when I woke up to a notification sound on my phone. I reached under the bed to try and grab it, but I couldn't feel my phone. What I'd grabbed instead was a person's hand. By then, it was already too late. I felt the hand grasp my arm, and I screamed for everyone to get up. My dad came rushing in and pulled a man from underneath the bed. I noticed it was the very same man we'd seen earlier. The fight was over in seconds. My dad beat the man senseless. We called the police, and they arrived within minutes, arresting the man soon after. The police and my dad also found his boat in our marina. I don't like describing what they found on that boat. My dad didn't tell me or my friend, but a few days ago when I turned 19, He finally told me what was there. He said he'd gone into the boat accompanied by the police, and the first thing they'd noticed was the smell of a terribly bad odor. Then they saw the body bags. The man was put in prison for life, and I'm grateful to this day I had my dad on that trip with us. My dad saved us from something horrible happening that night, but I've always wondered something. I wonder what would have happened had my phone not made that notification noise and woken me up that night. I like to go fishing in the lakes and rivers in my area. It's a pretty huge area, with tons of hills and forests as well. There's a lake in there that's a pretty big fishing and swimming spot. If you take your boat off of the lake though and out into the river, very often you can find yourself very much alone. Every now and then I like to take my boat out on that river and even spend the night on the river as well. The only bad thing about sleeping in a boat is that you can get yourself a real stiff neck by the time morning comes around. A year ago, I had a much more harrowing experience than a stiff neck out on the river. It was the beginning of the fall, and the leaves had mostly turned different colors. They hadn't begun falling out of the trees yet, though. The hills were very beautiful. There weren't many people out on the lake because of the temperature either, so it made sense to go out. School was back in session around that time as well, and parents didn't tend to take their kids out when that was happening. It was cool to me though, because I knew I would have some really good alone time. It didn't take long before I'd found my way out on the river. The lake was mostly empty. The river was completely empty though. I began fishing and had quite a lot more luck than I expected to. Perhaps it was my lucky day. I was so engrossed that I completely lost track of time as I slowly continued to float down the river. The sun began to go down eventually, and I found myself beginning to feel spontaneously creeped out. I wasn't exactly sure why. I'd been in this place many times before all by myself. Perhaps it may have had something to do with how empty the lake was as well. Even when people liked being by themselves and when they liked being lonely, the loneliness can still be frightening if it's too much. I wish I could truly explain what this feeling was like. The sun was just setting behind one of the hills, making the sky a bright orange-pink color. Not only that, but its appearance was blazing behind all those different colored trees on the hill, making the scene look almost like an oil painting. It was nice to see. No words can do that beauty justice. As I continued floating down the river, the sun eventually went fully down. I was left in the dark now. I had some lights on my boat, of course, but only the ones I was legally required to have. The sun was soon replaced by the moon, which was full and bright that night. The light reflected off the river. I don't know how long it had been that I drifted down before I heard a noise come from around me. It wasn't exactly a scream. It was more like an angry, frustrated yell. I perked up and immediately looked in the direction of that sound, and I'll never forget what I saw. I saw two men standing out in the woods, not so deep that I couldn't see them. They looked like they were fighting, but it was a very one-sided fight, at least to me. The bigger man had knocked the smaller man hard upside the head. His body crumpled to the ground. The bigger man then grabbed his arm and dragged his limp body off into the forest. Not once did either man seem to have noticed me though, as far as I knew. I wasn't exactly sure how to react. I was of course shocked, but after a moment I quickly pulled out my cell phone. Of course, it didn't have a signal out here. I cursed a few times and took my boat to the shore. I put down a marker so I would be able to find the area again. I intended to direct the police to it. I wanted to be quiet as well, because I didn't want that man to come back. After placing the marker, I got back in my boat and tried to get back to the lake area. I kept as far from the man's side of the shore as I could. After a few minutes, though, something caught my eye. I looked back at the shore and I was sure I could see some movement there. I couldn't quite make out what it was, though. I got back to the lake area eventually, and went past the parking lot area to the dock. My truck was one of only 2 vehicles in the lot. There was one other truck, and it was now parked right beside mine. I could have sworn I saw someone sitting in the front seat quickly duck down as I approached. I checked my phone again to see I had a single bar. I quickly called the police and remained out on the lake until they arrived. They arrested the guy who was hiding in the truck, who confessed to getting into a fight with his brother before knocking him out. He had seen me in the boat and drove to the parking lot in order to make sure I kept my mouth shut. Fortunately, unlike the man initially thought, his brother had only been injured and was not dead. The man was still arrested, and I had to go to court for several months after that to testify. I grew up in a small town, total population of maybe 2,000 or so. Everyone knew everyone else, or at least knew your family members. It was a safe town with mostly middle-class working families. Nothing major ever happened, and the crime rates were low as well. Because of this, I grew up feeling safe and secure. To note, I grew up in the 90s as well. One summer day, my good friend Jenny and I were out for a bike ride. We were around 12 or 11 years old. We were allowed to bike anywhere we wanted, as long as we didn't leave town and wore our helmets. There was a new road being constructed in between the 2 main neighborhoods. The new road was to provide a shorter way of accessing the main one to get to the next town. At the time, it was still under construction, but very nearly complete. All that was left was paving and painting. Jenny and I decided to bike down the gravel road. Jenny and I were about halfway down. The road was about 1 kilometer long or so. At the halfway point, we noticed a man out walking. He appeared to be in his early 30s and seemed very handsome. I didn't recognize the man from around town, and neither did Jenny either. As we got closer, he broke out a big smile and waved hello. We said hello back, as he didn't seem threatening or scary. He asked us if we were having a good summer so far. He told Jenny and I he was a photographer from a nearby city and was in town to scout out some models for his new postcard company. Jenny and I apparently had very beautiful features. He said we could be models for him. He asked if he could take our pictures. He said we had the exact look he wanted, and the scenery right now was just perfect to promote the town. He knew he would sell tons of postcards, and we could all make some money for ourselves. Jenny and I eagerly agreed. He got us to stand with our hands on our hips and a big smile. He took a disposable camera out of his back pocket and began snapping photos. He took about 10 in total, from many different angles. I remember feeling pretty uneasy at some point, and said we should probably leave because we needed to be home soon. The man then said he would get in touch with our principal on the first day of school to give us some money from the postcard sales. We foolishly confirmed the local elementary school we went to, although it was also the only elementary school in town, so I guess it wouldn't have been hard to figure out either way. Neither of us gave him our names though, which is important for later. Jenny and I talked about becoming famous on the way home. I brought up to Jenny though that I wondered why he didn't have a professional camera if he was a photographer. She said she'd wondered that too, but cameras are pretty expensive, so maybe he didn't have a nice one with him, you know, in case it rained or something. That evening at supper, I told my parents about my new potential fame as well. They were horrified and got on the phone with Jenny's parents right away. The 2 sets of them called the police and gave statements. The police downplayed it, saying it was unusual but nothing criminal had technically happened. My parents gave us both a long lecture about safety, as did Jenny's parents, making an awesome total of 2 parental lectures. The following spring, Jenny and I were hanging out together. this time a little older and a little wiser, a lot more cautious as well. We were walking along a quiet side street, talking about music and TV shows. At this point, a minivan suddenly approached us and slowed down. A friendly-looking woman asked us if we knew where Smith's Road was. We told her she just needed to drive straight for less than a minute, and it's the first right-hand turn. She said she was having difficulty finding it though, and asked if we minded hopping in and showing her. Instantly, I said no this time. Jenny also declined. To our surprise, the woman then said it was okay, because she knew who we were. She called us both by first name, and said she'd seen us on a postcard. By now, we were both freaked out. We were on a stretch of the road that had no houses, and the nearest one was 100 meters away. It wasn't common for people to have cell phones back then, so neither Jenny or I had one. The woman continued to insist we get in her van. Jenny, who was normally super chatty, was staring into the vehicle intensely. Her body language was stiff, and I could tell she was scared. Suddenly, and seemingly out of nowhere, Jenny screamed for us to run. I didn't know what she'd seen, but I followed behind and ran as well. We ran off the road, through a field and into a yard another street over. I recognized this house as belonging to a school teacher. We pounded on her door and thankfully she answered. We told her what happened as well. Jenny then said something I'll never forget. She said she'd seen that very same photographer man from last summer crouching down and hiding behind the back row of seats. In that moment, she knew something bad was going to happen. The police and our parents were called. We gave statements and a vehicle description, as well as descriptions of the man and woman. Unfortunately, the police were never able to locate them. Jenny and I never saw the man or the woman again after. We had some serious trust issues with strangers after those encounters, and I had nightmares of being kidnapped all the way into early adulthood. Always make sure to teach your children that strangers are not safe, no matter how nice they seem. My situation could have had a much more unfortunate outcome if things had gone even slightly differently.